And sent lawmakers back to the drawing board Thursday after one chamber of Congress approved a spending bill without a key part of his agenda. The Senate passed a short-term measure Wednesday evening that would have funded the government until February 8th, but it did not include any funding for a border wall, one of Mr. Trump's key campaign promises. CBS News Chief Congressional correspondent Nancy Cordes has the latest.
I've made my position very clear. Any measure that funds the government must include border security.
The president's about face sent lawmakers scrambling as the chances of a shutdown shot up.
There's no consensus right now on what the best way forward is.
Just yesterday, GOP leaders thought they had hit on a compromise Mr. Trump could live with, a short-term spending bill funding the government through February 8th, giving them another shot to bargain for border wall funding in the new year.
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
The Senate passed the bill unanimously last night, but then the president started to get an earful from the far right.
No way.
The wall has to be built.
This is a fumble. If we're not going to fight now, when are we going to fight?
By this morning, no one was quite sure where he stood.
Have you gotten any assurances from the White House or the president himself that he will sign this spending resolution?
I don't know that anybody ever has any assurances from the White House on any subject.
House Republican leaders headed to the White House to find out.
The president informed us that he will not sign the bill that came over from the Senate last evening.
Congressional negotiators had already settled on $1.6 billion for border security next year. But the president wants $5 billion more, specifically for a border wall. Without a deal before tomorrow night, a partial shutdown will leave more than 400,000 government workers furloughed right before Christmas. But the president has said it's worth it.
I am proud to shut down the government.
His patience wearing thin as his party has repeatedly tried and failed to secure the funding for his campaign promise.
I say to Congress, I will never sign another bill like this again.
And Nancy Cordes joins us now from Capitol Hill. Nancy, it seemed the president had toned down his demands for border wall funding earlier this week. So what changed?
Right. I mean, just 24 hours ago, Elaine, you and I were talking, and I was telling you that the president was saying that he was going to get this border wall funding elsewhere, that he was going to ask his cabinet secretaries to pony up the money instead and make that work somehow, because it was clear that it wasn't going to be coming from Congress right now. But then he suddenly started hearing from conservative commentators and conservative lawmakers who felt that the party, and he in particular, was squandering the best chance that he had to try to extract some kind of concession from Democrats before Democrats get even more powerful and take control of the House in January. And so suddenly he sort of went from signaling that he was going to sign this short-term spending deal to being kind of wishy-washy this morning. And House Republicans really couldn't tell where he stood, and that created its own problem, picking up Republican support. These House Republicans were saying to their leadership, hey, we don't want to cave on a border wall if the president is going to turn around and accuse us of caving on the border wall and not sign this spending deal if it doesn't have border funding in it. So, really everyone was sort of running around here with like chickens with their heads cut off, trying to figure out what to do. Finally, House Republican leaders went to the White House to talk to the president in person, and that's apparently when he said, yeah, I am going to hold out. I don't like this deal after all. And so, as we see so often, this was not part of the script. A large chunk of the Senate has already left town, and we're watching to see whether the House can even pass a short-term spending measure that includes the $5 billion that the president says he wants.
Well, what about senators? How are they responding to this news?
They thought that this was all sort of a formality at this point. In fact, they voted universally last night to pass this short-term spending measure, and a lot of them jumped on airplanes, Elaine, this morning. And so you can imagine the consternation when they're now being told by Senate leadership, you may need to come back because the House may pass something that looks nothing like what the Senate just passed last night. And, you know, in order for the president to have something to sign, the Senate would then have to pass exactly what the House passed. The problem is that's not going to happen. If House Republicans are successful at passing a bill that includes this border wall funding, it is almost certainly going to go down in the Senate, where Republicans need 60 votes and Democrats have already said they're going to vote no. So at this point, Elaine, it is really hard to see how these two sides come together with some kind of solution and find a bill that Democrats and Republicans can live with and that the president can sign in time to avert a shutdown on Friday night.
You mentioned that pressure that the president's been feeling from conservatives, people who've traditionally been allies of the president over this issue. Right. But so is there any kind of leverage that some lawmakers have with the president in order to strike a deal by Friday?
Well, that's the challenge that they face so often, Elaine, is that they think that they have found something that they that the president will, that they can hold the president to, and then he changes his mind after he turns on Fox and Friends or starts reading what some of his favorite conservative hosts are saying on Twitter, and then the deal everyone thought they had the day before is null and void. Sometimes it's even people within his own administration who are telling him that the deal is no good and that he ought to back off on what he agreed to or signaled that he would agree to the day before. And so, you know, that is, we've seen this happen not just on this issue, but on multiple issues in the past. And it is incredibly frustrating for Republican leaders, but this is the hand that they have been dealt. And while, yes, technically the votes probably exist to override a presidential veto, if he were to veto whatever he gets from Congress, the votes are there, but that puts Republicans in an awfully uncomfortable situation. These House Republicans having to go home to their constituents and say, the president wanted wall funding, but I vetoed that. He wanted to hold out, I didn't. You know, that's just a tough sell for a lot of House Republicans, so they're really in a bind here.
Sure. You mentioned, Nancy, senators getting on planes after that vote earlier. You know, there's also a number of lame duck Republicans in the House. So is there a concern about just getting members to show up and vote as the deadline approaches?
Interestingly, they've taken a couple of procedural votes already on Thursday afternoon, and surprisingly, almost all of the House Republicans showed up. So, so even some who had left town did end up coming back for this vote. You know, perhaps they didn't want to be around all week when they've already been kicked out of their offices and having to find a place to sleep because they can't sleep on their sofa in their office anymore. But they did come back for this vote, all but a handful. So that has not turned out to be as big of a challenge for Republicans as we thought it might be.
All right. Busy time this holiday season in Washington. Nancy Cordes for us. Nancy, thank you.
You're welcome.